Good. Hello, hello.
Is it on? Hello. Okay. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. On behalf of the Nelson Diocese, I warmly welcome you to this evening. I want to thank Nelson Tasman Climate Forum for organizing this event. Thank you to the Cathedral for hosting us here. Thank you to Carolyn Hughes for inviting me to introduce Rod Oram. Although I only just met Rod last night, I feel like his reputation precedes him. And many of you, I'm sure, won't require an introduction. But for those of you who do, I'll say a few words. Rod hails from the UK, but moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand in 1997 with his family. And he has over 40 years experience as an international journalist, business journalist. He has worked for various publications in Europe and North America, including the Financial Times of London. Rod contributes weekly to newsroom.co.nz, Radio New Zealand's 9 to noon, and to News Talk ZB. He is a frequent public speaker on sustainability, business, economics, and innovation, both here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and internationally. In Citigroup's 2019 Annual Global Journalism Awards, Rod was the winner in the General Business category for the Australia and New Zealand region for his articles on Fonterra in Newsroom. And he was also New Zealand Journalist of the Year. Now, there's much more that could be said, but I'd like to mention that I've been deeply impressed by some articles of Rod's that I've read in preparation for this event. Most of all, I'm impressed on his focus on nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. Jesus was always talking about paying attention to the creation, whether that was mustard seeds or the way yeast works its way through dough, or lilies of the valley. Rod is a man of faith, an Anglican for most of his life. And while people of faith can and do reach different conclusions about what we should do to move forward, I think there's consensus that we do need to move forward when it comes to climate change. And in order to move forward, we need to pay attention, as Jesus instructed us to do. And Rod also encourages us, pay attention. How does creation do it? How is resilience built into the creation that God has made? And how can we work with that rather than against it? How can the human economy fit in with and cooperate with the larger economy of God's creation? We urgently need to wrestle with and respond to that question, because a house divided cannot stand. So Rod, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here tonight. I know I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say on the topic of a faith response to the climate crisis. May we have ears to hear. By the way, I don't know if did I introduce myself? I am Courtney Wilson. I'm the Care of Creation Enabler for the Nelson Diocese, and I've had a chance to meet some of you, and I look forward to connecting to some others of you in the supper time after the talk. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you. Kia ora tatou, good evening, and it's a huge pleasure to be here. I was just about to introduce Courtney because she failed to introduce herself, so I'm very glad you did. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for coming out on this slightly crisp winter evening in a wonderfully Anglican cool cathedral, which I always enjoy hanging out in such places, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you. It's also a wonderful pleasure to be down here in the Nelson Tasman area for 3 days for a series of events with the Chamber of Commerce on Friday, for example, their Aspire conference, but Carolyn Hughes sitting back there and her colleagues at the Climate Action Forum for Nelson Tasman Carolyn's worked very hard to fit all sorts of chances for me to be out and about, including up to Golden Bay tomorrow and other places. So thank you hugely, Carolyn, for that. And this is a very splendid climate action book that the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum has prepared. And it is a superb plan for the region. And I thoroughly recommend it to you. So when we have some tea afterwards, please do track down Carolyn there. She'll be waving this, so you'll be able to have that discussion with her. Thank you very much also, Bishop Steve, for hosting us here tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here, so thank you. Let me start with this picture. It's not a true picture from space. It's just a bit of a mock-up from Google Earth. But in many ways, it's one of my favorite photos. We think of ourselves as a very small country, but that's actually not the least bit true. So we do have the land that's above water, but as we've learnt recently, it's not just the submerged bit of Zealandia below us, but there's actually a further, we've discovered, submerged continent below that. So we are actually a surprisingly large part of the planet. And wonderfully, the tectonic plates carve this huge Z all the way through the Pacific. Rather inconveniently, we sit on the Z, so that's a rather uncomfortable place to be in earthquake terms. But we are responsible for a remarkably large part of the planet. So our exclusive economic zone, as designated by the UN, is the 4th largest in the world. It's 15 times our land area. And out in those oceans, it's oceans that are rich with endemic, unique species to the planet. And in many ways, it's particularly the Southern Ocean has been the ocean that has been least devastated by humankind. And then, of course, our sphere of influence and our sphere that we take in particular interest goes right the way down to Antarctica. We were one of the handful of countries that were the original signatories of the Antarctic Treaty in the 1950s, late 50s, I guess that was. And then, of course, our great friends and neighbors up into the Pacific are also very much a part of our family. But even just the land of New Zealand, the distance from Cape Reinga to Bluff is 3,000 kilometers if you wander around a bit, as I've tended to do on my bicycle. Remarkably, the distance between Istanbul and London is 3,000 kilometers. And just imagine all of Europe essentially is embraced in that span. But that's the span of our country, albeit in a rather roundabout way. So we are residents of and responsible for a remarkable part of the planet. And in many ways, that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight, about one of only many of our crises. It's the climate crisis. Increasingly, we're starting to talk about this as being co-crises with the loss of biodiversity, and I'll expand on that point. But this is about our faith-based response to that. This is a quote: "We are in communion with nature," and I will explore that quote and explain where it comes from in due course. But this talk is very much about our relationship with creation, our relationship with the living earth, which is very badly fractured and is in need of earnest repair on our heart. That's our work, not creation's. So I'm going to be talking about creation and responsibility and faith in sort of 3 steps this evening. Every year, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and his predecessors in recent years have given a State of the Planet report, typically towards the end of the year. And this was what Guterres said in December last year. "We are facing a devastating pandemic, new heights of global heating, new lows of ecological degradation, new setbacks in our work towards global goals for more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development. To put it simply, the state of the planet is broken. Dear friends, humanity is waging war on nature. This is suicidal." And it's a palpably true proposition in that nature is literally our life support system. I should have said that I will be making these slides available in a PDF for anybody who wants to see them, so do not expect to be able to read that slide. But I will just give you the basic concept of it. On the left-hand side is human population, rising from 2.5 billion in 1950 to about 7.8 billion now. All being well, we hope it'll plateau about 10 billion by 2100. The orange charts there are the things we do. Those are our socioeconomic trends. It's population, GDP, water use, fertilizer consumption, all of those things. Across all of them, there is this important line here, which is 1950, because that's where you start to see this enormous kick-up in all of these trends. And so as recently as 1970, humanity was still living within the bounds of a single planet, but we have not been doing that since 1970. And therefore, we've been having this enormous impact on the Earth's systems, which is what these other charts over here are. And again, you've got that dotted line from 1950 onwards. You know, the top ones are the climate change gases, and then what's happening with ozone, surface temperature, ocean acidification, terrestrial biosphere degradation, and all the rest. This is the work of the Stockholm Resilience Center, which led them to create this concept of the planetary boundaries. So these are the geophysical chemical boundaries of the planet. And again, in this chart, on each of these, that would be the optimum state for us to be in. And that's where it's getting rather dodgy. That's where we overshoot those boundaries. So the biggest overshoot that humankind has done so far is the biogeochemical flows, and that's phosphorus and nitrogen, entirely from the way humankind farms. So we worry about nitrogen in our waterways here in New Zealand, which is a problem. We have less of a problem with phosphorus, but we still have a problem with phosphorus. But the nature of how we use land and how we grow food is responsible for the biggest overshoot. But the way we use land and grow food is also the cause largely of our overshoot on land use. And most particularly, the biggest overshoot so far, or second biggest overshoot so far, is the loss of biodiversity, species loss. Climate change has got a lot of pressure built behind it, and we know what trajectory we're on, but we haven't yet seriously breached that boundary, but we're getting very close to it. And so it's a question of how we live within that boundary. Let me just come back, though, to biodiversity. This is a work from last year from WWF and other scientists. This is about the loss of populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish. Shrank by 68% between 1970 and 2016. And only 2 years earlier, that level had only been 60%. So that's an accelerating rate of loss of populations. And then in terms of actual species loss, the level of species loss caused by our human activity is now running at 100 times faster than the natural background loss of species. So this is very much the 6th great extinction in the world of species, but this is the first extinction created by a species, which is us, as opposed to created by some phenomenon like a large asteroid hitting the planet. So that's why the biodiversity issue has become so much to the fore. And in some, our food, land, and ocean use, our infrastructure and built environment, our energy, and our extraction of resources have done almost 80% of that damage to the biosphere and to biodiversity. This is a very important report just out a few weeks ago from the UN's climate change framework, but also from its biodiversity framework. And so that's why we're increasingly talking about climate change, climate crisis, and biodiversity crisis in one, and how important it is to solve both at the same time, and how doing the right thing by nature, nature-based solutions, is capable of delivering about a third of what we need to do in the climate crisis. So technology, like electric vehicles and things, and clean energy will do some of that, but nature-based solutions will not only help us solve the climate crisis, but also help those ecosystems rebuild, help restore the health of our life support system. And I think this is a really important, relatively new framing of what needs to be done. This is from a virtual online event back in April that the Nobel Prize institution held about our planet and our future. And I won't deal with all the detail there other than leave it for you to see in the PDF if you want to pursue it further, and there's links to the report, etc. But the crucial line here is we must reinvent our relationship with the planet Earth. John Muir is one of my longtime heroes, born in Scotland, in Dunbar, east of Edinburgh. In fact, the declaration of interest, my niece runs the John Muir Birthplace Trust in Dunbar and Museum. He is as a child, he emigrated with his family to the United States, and he's considered absolutely the founder of the US environmental movement. So this wonderful picture, it's Muir on the right, obviously, and Teddy Roosevelt as president on the left. Muir took Roosevelt on a camping trip in the Yosemite, and here they are standing on Overhang Rock at Yosemite. And that's where he persuaded Roosevelt to create the national park system. So that's, and hence that book, My First Summer in the Sierra, in 1911. But this wonderful, wonderful phrase, which I think with great simplicity gets to the heart of this. When we tug at a single thing in nature, we find it attached to the rest of the world. Another quote, because this starts to point us towards faith. This is Gus Speth, wonderfully still alive and now an old man, a great originally environmental lawyer, went on to found several major US environmental organizations in the 1970s, and then went on to run the United Nations development program, not the environment program, the development program, about 2 people before Helen Clark. And this was a wonderful encapsulation by him in a BBC radio program a few years ago. I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Before I get to faith, I want to talk about responsibility, because you will see quite quickly in this section where faith comes into it. I'll just show you a bunch of wonderful graphs. I love graphs and charts, to just set a bit of a picture for you. We know what one of the key drivers of climate change is, our use of fossil fuels. And this is the extraordinary growth of annual carbon dioxide emissions since 1750. So this is the start of the Industrial Revolution. As it happens, I was born in 1950, so I take these issues kind of personally. It's my birth responsibility. But global emissions were only 5 billion tons per year at that point. But this has been the extraordinary growth since. So the annual rate of CO2 emissions has increased 7-fold in just the time I've been alive. Just as, when I was born, the population of the world was only 2.5 billion people, the same population today as India and China. So the year I was born, it was though all of humankind lived in India and China and nobody lived anywhere else. It was terra incognita. And human populations trebled at the time I've been alive so far. And yes, the US and Europe are big in here as they've developed, but plateaued in recent years. And then, of course, this is the rest of Asia and China, and to some extent India in there. Very little in the southern hemisphere in terms of developing nations there. And this is fossil fuel consumption per capita. The winners by far are the United States and Australia at an extraordinary 66,525 equivalent of megawatt hours of energy. We aren't third. I just plugged us into this chart, but we rank pretty high amongst developed nations. And you see that the whole of China, even though vastly bigger population than the US, is well behind there on a per capita basis. Phenomenal use of fossil fuels. And we obviously were burning coal for a long, long time, and then we discovered oil, and now we've been heaping gas on top of that. The next thing, though, is that there is an astonishing abundance of fossil fuels left. So there's about 114 years worth of coal in identified reserves. There's about 53 years of natural gas in identified reserves. There's probably a whole bunch more. We know there's a whole bunch more out there that's not identified. And oil, it's 50 years. So theoretically, even if we found no more oil fields or gas fields or coal fields, we could be burning fuels for fossil fuels for another 100 years. Well, that sounds like a singularly bad idea. How much we can burn if we want to keep the climate that we can basically cope with. This is a very optimistic view because it's a 2-degree world. We really need to be heading for a 1.5-degree world. But that's the total reserves of fossil fuels. That's unburnable, and that's what we can burn. If we're going to keep even just 2 degrees, it's a lot less for 1.5. So we've got this extraordinary problem of what is called the carbon bubble. 2,795 billion tons of CO2 that those companies know that they have. They carry them on their balance sheets, but it's utterly unburnable. All we can burn, and again, that's representing it 2 degrees, is about 500 billion tons. So we've got to find ways to persuade fossil fuel companies to stop doing that, to stop exploring for more, and to stop burning the stuff. We in New Zealand have a particular responsibility in that, in one sense, because our growth of emissions in the OECD in the period since 1990 has grown with the second fastest growth of CO2 emissions, bettered only by Turkey. But at the other end of the OECD, you've got Sweden and some other countries back here, which have reduced their fossil fuel emissions by about 50%, rather than increasing them as we have by the similar amount. So we've been particularly profligate as a country. 350.org, 350 being parts per million, a relatively safe level for CO2 in the atmosphere. We're now up to about 420 parts per million. Was a wonderful organization that got going in the States. Here in New Zealand, 350, Aotearoa, 350.org.nz, started the fossil-free New Zealand movement, getting on for almost 10 years ago. And other wonderful organizations like Generation Zero here, very effective in that campaign as well. In this campaign, about trying to shift investment patterns, trying to shift how fossil fuel companies worked, it's always been very important to make an important distinction about being a responsible consumer of fossil fuels versus being a responsible investor. And so we know we have to purge fossil fuels from our economies for climate, social, and economic reasons. Now, as yet, we still don't have at sufficient scale and economic viability ways to do that. But the faster we invest in those alternatives, the faster we'll get there and the better we'll be. So, whilst this is happening, and it's that this rate of change is accelerating now quite significantly, we need to use fossil fuels as sparing as we can, but at the same time have to help drive change, not just by reducing our demand, which puts pressures on those fossil fuel companies, but by being responsible consumers. So minimize our fuel use, maximize the use of alternatives, but crucially support companies that help us do both. Now here in New Zealand, I'm just going to deal with the major fossil fuel company suppliers here, rather than the small ones like Gulf or Waitomo. Z Energy is palpably different from BP, which is palpably different from Mobil, so our three main suppliers. Z Energy is different because it doesn't own upstream oil and gas fields. It is a refiner and a purchaser of refined products and then distributes them. So it doesn't have those legacy assets upstream that the major integrated fuel companies do. So it has a lot more flexibility, and it has some pretty switched on leadership about helping to major trucking companies, for example, to improve their fuel efficiency. And it's built a biofuel plant, which is mothballed at the moment, but when we get some change in government legislation soon to put in a biofuel mandate, that will be started up again. But then as responsible investors, we need to push for change. And that's where the whole movement for divesting investments from fossil fuel companies came from, and trying to invest in alternatives, which would actually logically include Z Energy, if one wanted to still be invested in the fossil fuel sector. I support Z Energy, but not to the point of wanting to invest in them. So the whole question then comes about how does a divestment campaign work? This was a superb piece of work in about 2013 from the Oxford University Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment about divestment movements. And this looked at the tobacco divestment and the South African divestment campaigns. And these basically started in the 1980s, late 80s and early 90s on both tobacco and South Africa. And going through three big phases, again, I won't bother you with the detail here, but it's all there in the PDF if you want. But the starting point of this, in those two divestment campaigns, it was faith-based organizations and university endowments which were the leaders in this. And the very interesting, this is in tobacco divestment, you see a very slow build through here, and then it really started to take off, both in terms of the number of financial institutions that divested, but also the volume of funds. And so that's the history of divestment movement that the fossil fuel divestment movement took heart from and learnt lessons from. So what about faith-based institutions? Well, every faith at its center has huge life springing from and commitment to creation. So we Christians are in no way unique about that. And then when we come down to Anglicans, worldwide in the Anglican communion, we have 5 marks of mission. We originally only had 4 from about the mid-80s, and finally in 1990 we gained worldwide a 5th mark. So it's about to nurture, to evangelize, to serve. But the 2 lower ones are the really important ones in the context I'm talking of tonight. It's about, on the right-hand side, to preserve the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. That's one of our marks of mission. We are enjoined, we are encouraged, we are emboldened to go out into the world to preserve the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the planet. The one on the left is the mark of mission is to transform the unjust structures of society, challenge violence, and pursue peace and reconciliation. I think it would be widely accepted that that would also embrace these issues about our relationship with creation, because we are dealing with some deeply unjust structures of society that arise from these issues of ecosystem destruction, displacing people from land, but also, of course, it's about the violence we are showing towards creation and all the rest. So that's why 2 of our marks of mission very much talk directly to these issues. So back in 2013, as you know, we've got this wonderful 3 Tikanga constitution. So this is what was going on within Tikanga Pakeha in our constitution. 5 of our 7 diocesan synods passed divestment motions. The other 2 only missed because of agenda or timing issues. And this was quite a spontaneous movement around the country. We found ourselves, I was working on this in the Auckland diocese, but we found ourselves working particularly with Wellington and particularly to some extent Christchurch and down in Dunedin as well. So having done that in the annual diocesan synods, we then took a motion to General Synod in 2014, which very wonderfully, because of course it was our bicentennial year of the first preaching of the gospel in Ohibe and in the Bay of Islands on Christmas Day 1814. So a General Synod that year was at Waitangi. And we passed unanimously a province-wide, so Aotearoa in the Pacific, Tikanga Pakeha, Tikanga Māori, Tikanga Pacifica, a divestment motion. It was a very straightforward motion about full divestment, and reporting back to Synod. We didn't build into it a highly detailed penalties or timetable. We were hoping for reports back by 2016, and we got some. But we had a very mixed story. We had some church funds moving fast on this. Trust management, which helps a lot of church trusts manage their finances, was particularly active in moving quite quickly to get fossil fuels out of their investment portfolios, creating a whole new fund, an Australasian equity fund with no fossil fuels in it, for example. I'd have to say the most resistant church financial institution was the clergy pension fund. And that remains the case today. The next part of this was Tikanga Pacifica was saying, we support this, but in the Pacific, we are on the front line of all this. So can the money that comes out of fossil fuels go into investments that help us deal with the climate crisis? So between 2014 and 2016, and I was largely responsible for this work, we were looking around for, if you were a church trust fund, could you invest in something that looked like a stock or bond that you would normally invest in, i.e. very tradable in case you wanted to exit, and low risk, and with some income, which are three perfectly reasonable investment goals to have, that could come out of fossil fuels, money could come out of fossil fuels and go into that kind of security. Well, there weren't any around. There were a few private equity funds and such things, but that's completely inappropriate for church trust funds to be invested in. So we went back to General Synod in 2016 and said, look, that the financial markets are too early stage for this at the moment. That won't work. But as a first step, we would like to propose, and we put this motion, that General Synod in all its travel, air travel, would offset all that air travel in carbon offsets. And that was approved. And at the 2018 General Synod, the support was to support this rainforest conservation project in Vanuatu in Fiji. This is a wonderful project. The carbon credits run by ECOS, a Wellington company, with very high standards. So this is about 400 families protecting over 4,000 hectares of tropical rainforests up in the hills in Vanuatu, and 9 clans, and doing that, and all these carbon credits certified by the original carbon credit certification system out of the UK. And this has produced a wonderful income flow for some 400 people in these families. And it's given them an extra reason to hold on to that rainforest. There was a wonderful moment, though, at General Synod when there was a bit of a mumbling from some of the Tikanga Pacifica, and they said, well, crikey, we know those people up there in Vanuatu, they're Methodists. Can't we have an Anglican offset? Fortunately, I hadn't anticipated that question, but I happened to be having dinner a few nights before in General Synod with one of our wonderful bishops from Tikanga Pacifica, who was chatting about his life on the island. And he said, well, we Anglicans grabbed all the good beachfront property, and the Methodists had to get that scrappy land up in the hills. I didn't think of that at the time. And then he said, oh, it's a real problem. There's so much logging going up there, it's silting up the river. And I have to keep changing my boat for a shallower draft boat. So quick as a flash, I just sort of, in this debate at General Synod, I said, look, don't worry, I know they're Methodists, but you all grabbed the best beachfront property. You should be very glad that they're not logging and contributing to the silting up of your end of the river. And that seemed to settle everybody down a bit. So we haven't been pushing our church institutions to divest more for a variety of reasons, not all good ones, i.e. people being getting caught up in other climate change issues. And it's time for us to go back and give a prod to the people who are still being very slow on it. Because what's been going on is there's been this massive divestment worldwide, not just people exiting fossil fuel companies because that's an investment choice they've made, but people have declared that they are part of this fossil fuel divestment movement. So when we started in 2014 on this in New Zealand, we were the first, we beat the Church of England to this by some considerable period of time. So we were very early on, there was about $200 billion of divestment at that point, and that's now grown 70-fold. But this chart is an interesting one about that, because this is what kind of institutions are divesting. The leaders are still faith-based organizations, followed by educational institutions that are responsible for 50% of this divestment. So the leadership by faith-based organizations and universities has carried on a pace. And so it wasn't something we just got started. We've continued to put a lot of momentum behind. So that's the amazingly important role we played. And it absolutely fits that chart I showed you of what happened in the tobacco and South Africa divestment movements. So this has been an absolute textbook case of change. Meanwhile, of course, there's been a lot going on with clean energy, and so this is what's been happening to the stock market performance of coal companies. So if you index that to 100 in 2010, coal companies are now virtually worthless. And this is oil and gas, level pegged at about indexed to 100. But the rest of the S&P 500 has increased on an index to 350, so 3.5 times. So that's this extraordinary parting of company. So oil and gas companies used to be very good investments. You could make lots of money off them. That is not true anymore. And therefore, any fund manager that has had you in oil and gas companies, or even worse, coal companies, since 2014 has underperformed the rest of the market. This is all global equities, and it's the difference between the blue line and the yellow line there as to whether this is the world index with fossil fuels and minus fossil fuels. So the church trusts, including our Anglican Clergy Pension Fund and the Kiwi Saver Fund that it runs, has failed its fundamental fundamental fiduciary responsibility, because it's made investment decisions which have left its beneficiaries less well off. So forget the moral issues, forget the 5 marks of mission. Just from an incredible narrow financial fiduciary point of view, they have failed. Meanwhile, our superannuation fund has essentially decarbonized its energy portfolio. So that's the story of one example of faith-based action. And the very small role, relatively, given our small size, we played in Aotearoa in New Zealand in that global activity. So now I want to move on to talk a little more broadly, quite a lot more broadly, about faith. I'm now going to say some incredibly bare bones kinds of things, and I'm sorry, this is in no way a sophisticated analysis. Perhaps we could think of theology as about how we try to give expression to our understanding of God, not the least of which God's great gift of his radical abundance. I'm obviously not using his in a gender-specific term. And about God's relationship to creation and to us. And another point that I want to make about theology, amongst many I could, is about redemption, about us being made whole. And here's that quote: "We are not consumers of what God has made, we are in communion with it." Which is something quite wonderful that Rowan Williams said when he was Archbishop of Canterbury. And to me that just kind of encapsulates everything about our relationship with nature, with creation. Now this is a very, very confronting quote. It's from Lynn White, the US historian and theologian, in 1966. He wrote a very seminal paper called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. This usually causes offense. Both our present science and our present technology are so tinctured with orthodox Christian arrogance towards nature that no solution for our ecologic crisis can be expected from them alone. Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. We must rethink and refeel our nature and destiny. So, faith. I guess, sorry, this is hardly an all-encompassing term, but I think of it in many ways about our response to God in terms of what we believe and the empowerment we gain from that and the enlightenment we gain from that. Here's another quote. "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." Albert Einstein. I have zero problem with that. John Bishop, a wonderful philosopher and theologian in Auckland, a friend, was on a sabbatical some years ago in the UK, just when the scientists down at CERN over in Europe were about to discover the Higgs boson particle, and they invited philosophers, theologians, and scientists to come and discuss what were the common searches they were engaged in. What was the commonality in the searches they were engaged in? And so, for me, I have, to me, science and religion have a lot to say to each other. Then the next point is about community. It's about how we act on our understanding of God. When we are really good at this in our faith, we do relate well to each other and one another. Hopefully we can discuss difficult things. Hopefully we can achieve some kind of understanding. Hopefully we can offer each other support. Hopefully we can act together. In that sense of community, I think two words matter a lot. I mean, this is obviously a personal thing here. There are lots of words that matter. But two words that mean a lot to me are inspiration, which is from the Latin inspirare, which is to breathe into, as in a spirit, and enthusiasm, from the Greek enthus, possessed by a god. So it seems to me that if our faith can help give inspiration and enthusiasm to people in these very difficult conversations and actions, then our faith has made a very big difference. So our opportunity is when we're good at this, we can do good things about bringing people together about trying to help people deal with the sheer complexity of these multiple interlinked global crises and deal with this fabulous paradox that that the best response to all these things is local, which is why we have things like local climate forums. But we're dealing with truly global issues. And so many of the great crises of the world are not local, they're totally global. And so our best response is local, multiplied up in all sorts of wild and wonderful, not, well, wild, I just mean that in terms of exciting and ambitious ways across the world. So the challenge is, what we need to do is to apply our timeless faith, our understanding that theology and liturgy and worship help us on that journey to contemporary responses, to give expression to these timeless things on these very, very contemporary responses. Lastly, in this leg of the talk, I just want to draw a little bit on Marcus Borg in his book, Speaking Christian. Salvation has come rather narrowly to mean life after death. But in the Bible, it's seldom about an afterlife. Rather, it's about transformation this side of death. So imagine the transformation we need here and now, the salvation that we so desperately need. Redemption is now largely about being saved from sin, but in the Bible, it's about being freed from slavery. So imagine freedom from enslavement, such as inequitable economic systems or our grievous damage to the life systems of the planet, to creation. And righteousness is so often these days about individual virtue. But in the Bible, righteousness was far more a collective virtue. So imagine a world of justice for all, social, economic, environmental, and in all its other forms. Then we really, truly would be meeting the high expectations that those marks of mission, particularly the two I mentioned, enjoin us to do. And through all this, above all, we must ensure that we speak with truth and with power and with simplicity. We speak truth with power, simplicity, and beauty. A few sources. The Anglican Communion worldwide has a very wonderful environmental network, if you're not familiar with it. I just was, for preparing this, I was on their website and spotted this, that prophetic indigenous voices on the planetary crisis. This is an upcoming series in Advent. And you'll see that I've highlighted there, contribution will come from Aotearoa and Polynesia on the 30th November. So again, that's another very fine example of our unique culture and combination of people here and this, in many ways, quite unique and distinctive corner of the planet in terms of life on land and in the air and in the water. I think that's going to be a real treat to listen to. And then upcoming, we've got, of course, Season of Creation in the weeks leading up to the feast day of St. Francis in October. And a wonderful celebration guide here, and a home for all. So it's the oikos bit. So there's a common word in economy and ecology, which is from the Greek word for home. So economy comes from the home, looking after literally the home you live in. Whereas, of course, as that word's applied in ecology, it's a wonderful way of thinking about ecosystems. And another example there, the Global Catholic Climate Movement. And this is a wonderful day of prayer they have every Friday in Rome, but online to the world, celebrating and supporting this sort of action. Very much inspired by Pope Francis's encyclical Praise Be. This was just a word map from it at the time. And you can see God, human, world. And so it wasn't just all about environment. It was one of, I think, the most powerful and comprehensive critiques of the failing of all our systems and the unjustness of them, not just our ecological one, and but it's also about our economic and social injustice systems as well, and the deep inequities in them. Now, here's a challenging prospect. Nikki Hare is a psychology professor at University of Auckland and a friend of mine. And Nikki's written wonderful books. One is The Infinite Game. Another one is The Psychology for a Better World, about how we respond to the climate crisis. But Nikki is engaged this year on a very brave and bold investigation because, as she says on this website, she grew up in a household with no faith, no religion. And it's something that she's come to rather later in life. And she's very, very intrigued about, as she says here, what are some of the insights and practices from religion, that would work for us in a secular context, about ceremonies and other elements of our human relationships on these difficult issues. And I think Nikki's embarked on something really important. I'm going to tell one last story, but I just want to finish this section with this wonderful quote from Rachel Carson, again, another fundamentally important person in the environmental movement, with her 1962 book, Silent Spring, about how pesticides were killing birds. The human race is challenged more than ever before to demonstrate mastery, not over nature, but of ourselves. And I just want to tell a little story, because this is, to me, a story about witness. It's a story about being out in the marketplace. Oh, sorry, one last thing before I get there. We've got the United Nations Biodiversity Summit, COP14, in China in October, and then we've got the climate negotiations in Glasgow in November. And Interfaith Scotland, because these are truly interfaith issues, is working on a wonderful program to support all faiths in Glasgow. And I recommend their website to you for the interfaith perspective on what they're up to. And one of their partner organizations, for example, is the ACT Alliance, which is 135 church and faith-based organizations. And so this is truly all faiths. And whilst I've spoken this evening in a Christian context and narrowly in an Anglican context, to me the most fruitful exploration for this is in an interfaith context. So here's the story. That fabulous cross there is the Melanesian Martyrs' Cross. The history of it is been rather lost, but the contemporary history is very interesting indeed. That's gorgeous cross with wonderful power and other shells decorating it. And it's in safekeeping at St. John's College. But in its recent history, it led the Anglican Church protests against the Springboks tour. That cross was on the field on the rugby pitch in Hamilton. And it was our young climate champions who got permission from St. John's College to start taking this on climate marches recently. And so this was before the September 2019 school strike for climate, as we were leaving the cathedral. And multiple messages. Our young people were particularly effective. So here we are in Altea Square, and it's the second picture I like, the right-hand one, because we're vying with the Sky Tower there for reaching for the heavens. However, it was strongly suggested to our young people that the Melanesian cross should really be retired. It was suffering in these excursions. So our young climate leaders in the Diocese of Auckland made a new cross and had carved all sorts of wonderful things on it, not the least of which this memorial to Bishop Jim White, who died too young last year. Here's Bishop Ross blessing the cross. And this was at Easter. And our young people took the cross out on Stations of the Cross as we moved from Nelligan House by the Cathedral to All Saints Ponsonby. Here's one of the Stations of the Cross at St. Matthew in the city. And it was wonderful taking it through the streets of Auckland on its maiden outing. And then it turned up at the next school strike for climate. And that's Sarah West, the Reverend Sarah West, who's the leader of our young Auckland Diocese social justice group. One last thing. This is, well, I'll let the words speak for themselves. I'll tell you who they're from. It's from Catherine Jeffett Scurry when she was presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. This was on I think it was All Souls Day 2006. Let the pain of the world seize us by the throat. Listen for Jesus calling us. Calling us all out of our tombs of despair and apathy. May the shock of baptismal dying once more set us afire. The place we call home is meant to be a new heaven a new earth, a holy city, a new Jerusalem. It is the sparks in the stubble that will make it so. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Rod. You've given us much to think about. The thing you said that most resonated with me was the line by Gus Speth, that selfishness, greed, and apathy are the main environmental problems. And that's what's needed is a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that, but the church does. And I find great hope in that. So now we'd like to offer some time for those of you who may have questions for Rod, and I'm willing to be the person going around with the microphone. Who's first?
Rod, thank you very much for a very inspirational talk. Can you tell us why Sweden has done so well at bringing down their carbon emissions?
Yes, that was a bit faint at the back. The question was, how has Sweden done so well? It's because they've got their act together. They've understood for a long time this is what they need to do. And they've just got on and done it. I'm sorry, it's that simple at one level.
Are they into nuclear power then?
That is a small part of the mix, but by no means all of the story. And so, for example, they are pioneers now in a technology for making steel without using coal to do that. It's basically using hydrogen. And Volvo, this gets rather complicated because Volvo is now owned by a Chinese company, but the cars are still made in Sweden, has committed to making one particular model of car from steel made that way, so zero emission steel. That's zero emissions if the hydrogen is produced from a clean energy source, which is a key caveat. So the Swedes are just onto it because they believe it and they've got their act together. So I'm making it sound incredibly simple, but actually that's kind of at the heart at it.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Rod, Mr. Oram, for coming in and explaining this to us. Now, with COVID happening, and you've put on some statistics of how the carbon has gone up, but with COVID, did that buy us some time to replenish the earth? Because everyone suddenly, because when it was, we were on lockdown, countries and even us, we suddenly have the birds coming out singing again, and even in my own country, the Philippines, the Manila Bay used to be really dark and all polluted. Suddenly it was becoming blue again. So did that buy us a bit of time, or is it just, would it need another COVID to kind of lock this down and replenish the earth or something?
COVID did something, it did several things which are incredibly important. First of all, it gave us that glimpse of what the future has to be like, because actually this isn't optional, we actually have to get there. So I hope that was encouraging to people, because it's a real life example. The second thing COVID did, with varying degrees of success in various countries, showed that societies can respond to a immediate and present danger very effectively. But unfortunately, with climate and all these other issues, very, very few people believe they are current and present and chronic problems. So there is still a degree of apathy and lackadaisicalness, I'm not sure that's a word, about how we respond. But then the third thing that the pandemic showed us was that nature recovers very quickly when we, I'm trying to think of a powerful metaphor here, when we stop strangling it, basically. When we give nature a chance, it actually recovers surprisingly quickly. But the problem here is we're leaving such a remnant of nature left, and we're whittling down that remnant so fast, the longer we leave this, the less there will be for nature to rebuild from. So nature won't bring back an extinct species, for a start. And then the last thing that the pandemic showed us, that as soon as economic activity was back to where it was pre-pandemic, nothing's changed. In fact, global emissions in the 12 months from, say, late last year through to late this year, so 12 months of relatively light pandemic restrictions, those emissions will probably be higher than in the previous year pre-pandemic. So in that sense, we learned nothing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
You talked about the importance of transformation as a moral response by all of us, but it's what we need to do is obviously global. And you haven't used the word revolution. How do we spread the word in a way beyond what we saw downtown Auckland? It's a big problem that only now, today, we're understanding. For example, you mentioned oceans at the beginning. Our oceans are heating, as you probably know, much faster than we imagined, pushing us well beyond the tipping points. So transformation incrementally is not enough, is it?
No, I would never, ever use the word incremental, because what has to happen is an utterly unprecedented speed of change, scale of change, and complexity of change that humankind has never come within cooey of before. This makes the pandemic look like, I was going to say child's play, but children play in complicated ways. But I can't be more direct than that. It is it often feels completely daunting what needs to be done, but it's got to be done. And I do retain quite a lot of confidence that messages are getting through. We are beginning to break some of the log jams. But I remain desperately, and I'm using that word pretty directly and accurately in terms of how I feel about this, conscious of how short the time is. And I think it's that time frame that worries me more than anything else. And of course, in all this, I tend to focus mostly on mitigating, i.e. stop doing the damage, but there's the very important part of adapting to the damage we've already caused, and will accelerate even when we stop putting the input into that damage. So even if we've got very rapidly to zero fossil fuel emissions, there's such a force behind climate crisis now that things would get worse before they stabilize. And in fact, we all know there are various tipping points that then make that change run away. Then we're in deep, deep trouble. We're in deep, deep trouble now, but sorry.
Is it possible that, I want to say that I was very struck by the two quotes that you showed us, that the problem fundamentally was a spiritual or religious one, and the solution must be in that realm too. And I wondered, is it possible for Christianity, in conversation with those who represent Maori spiritual values, to move in the direction needed, the values of relationship with the world of living nature, the web of life, and our responsibility, or kaitiakatanga, to act in an appropriate way with the web of life. Is that conversation possible, and is that conversation a possible pathway forward?
Yes, very, very, very strongly yes. I'll take a big view of that and come back to a specific. The big view of this is that when I use faith, when I talk about religions, I am talking about the main faith of the world. But very interestingly, there's a group in the ACT Alliance which it recognizes paganism. So I don't know, because if you are, I haven't really explored this very deeply, but if, as I'm thinking about this, if one is pagan, one has a relation. One is not thinking of a relationship with some god. You're thinking of some relationship with the rest of the living earth. And so I think that that's completely wonderful, because at the heart, it is about that relationship with the rest, with other living things. Now, that doesn't have to be, so I'm using the word spiritual very loosely there, as opposed to sort of a direct relationship with God, or taking a sort of a narrow religious or faith-based version of the word spiritual. But I guess my basic sense about how this all plays out is that I don't think humankind will do enough about all these issues until we care enough, and I don't think we'll care enough until we have some kind of spiritual relationship with the rest of the earth. Now, that's where, to our Maori, a Maori worldview, I think is, and indeed other indigenous worldviews, I think are incredibly important. So one of the fascinating things that I think I know is going on in the country is Te Ao Māori is turning up in some remarkable places. So for example, yesterday evening I was involved in an award ceremony for responsible investors. Our first speaker of the evening was Adrian Orr, Chief Executive, Governor of the Reserve Bank. And the Reserve Bank can explain its role and the financial system's role in Te Ao Māori terms. And Adrian was using those online yesterday evening. And then in the National Science Challenges, all 11 of the National Science Challenges, is built into their charters, these are decade-long projects, built into their charters, Mātauranga Māori, in Māori knowledge. And so I'm seeing in some of the National Science Challenges, in particularly our land and water, biological heritage, and remarkably, even in science and technology for innovation, National Science Challenges, taking Mātauranga Māori very seriously. And it's wonderful how that's been progressing. And I think the science challenges are really at the forefront of this, because for so long, that was a tick-the-box exercise. Oh yeah, no, we consulted with Māori on Mātauranga Māori, and then we got on and did our Western science. But what's going on now is a genuine understanding of the enormous opportunity that opens up when you take traditional knowledge like that and working with, if you like, Western science to progress both knowledges. And that's what's happening. So I think that that's spectacularly interesting about us in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I think I'm sure that's going to be one of our significant contributions as a people to these global issues.
Hello, Rod. Many thanks for coming and visiting us again. Lovely to get your insights. Like others, I was picked up on some specific things you say, and one of them I liked was the conversation you described between the scientists and the theological community. I'm particularly interested in trying to bridge gaps between the people that are concerned about the climate journey we're on and the people that are trying to suggest we shouldn't be concerned about it. And I would be interested, it seems to me that faith-based organizations are one of the organizations that perhaps does bridge that gap, has the potential to anyway, although I think we can think of places where it might reinforce the gap as well. I'd really like to hear your view on the role of faith-based organizations in weaving a web of common understanding and helping reduce the them and us, the divisions that often make it harder to make effective progress. Thank you.
I wholeheartedly endorse that, Lindsay. And that's what I was sort of trying to explain as I was stepping through a sort of a rather Rod-esque view of theology and faith and our faith-based communities. But I'm going to have to be incredibly direct here. And I say this with great respect and love for. I'll start with our Anglican Church. As a church, we are managing decline. And where we think of mission or being engaged in some sort of evangelism, some sort of outreach to the wider world, we're still tending to do that in a very, sorry, please do jump all over me afterwards. But what I'm struggling to say is here, we do, if there is evangelism there, it's in what to me is a very narrow view of the Bible and faith and spirituality and the rest. And speaking personally, I'm not comfortable with that, because I think that we have in our Anglican tradition, and certainly in our Christian tradition, some far more compelling insights to offer and comfort to offer people. And in many ways, it goes back to that language I used or borrowed from Borg about understanding what redemption and salvation are. So I think we're doing, so we're so busy managing our decline, and we are completely missing the opportunity as a church and as Christians as a faith to offer people a lot more in terms of helpful spiritual guidance and hope to get us through these difficult issues. So the answer is yes, but we're doing an abysmal job of it. Oh, sorry. Yes, you do. Please do.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. My name is Sylvia Purdy. I'm here from Arosa, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I am wanting to tautoko Rod's talk and particularly mention about my experience within the church as churches grappling with this. There is, outside of the Anglican communion, if I could comment on some of what the trends that I see happening in the church in New Zealand, many of the churches that are connecting with younger people, as you know, perhaps more Pentecostal or evangelical, and for them they're kind of caught in some of this tension between, as John Stott put it, whether faith is about escape from the world or engagement with the world, that we actually have to make this choice as to whether we see salvation as ultimately an escape. And if you are coming from that worldview, then really the problems that Rod has described this evening are really not our problem, which is kind of a scary idea, really. And so I would say that I would personally claim to be part of a movement within the church which is about engaging with the world. And even for those churches that have a very strong supernatural component to their life and mission and worship, I do see many being interested in what is going on in the world and wanting to be part of that in local communities particularly. So the whole eco-church movement in New Zealand is about giving some resourcing and some framework and some networking for churches that want to connect with people in our communities who do care about the state of our environment, and to do that with integrity and caring for creation in authentic ways in our own local places. So I do see, churches, even some of the big evangelical Pentecostal churches, wanting to have recycling bins and look at how they reduce their rubbish as a church, and working with local groups on a planting project down by the river, or and also particularly something that really connects across all the different theological strands in the Christian church is a heart for pastoral care, for people's well-being. The idea of hauora and well-being was one that connects well with any Christian strand, and we all have this heart for our young people as they're affected by the effects of eco-anxiety and the troubles and the stresses of our world. So no one can ignore those things. They're just so prevalent now, as there's just kind of waves of despair and hopelessness, especially among our younger people. So mission in this time has to include an environmental component, not as a compliance thing, not as a burden, but because we are just part of this world, and we are working out the mission of Christ in this place and time.
Hallelujah. Thanks.
I've got just a few brochures, I'll put them.
I was going to say, I'm happy to keep talking, but I know tea is available, so I don't want to hold you back from tea. You've been very good. good and patient. Thank you.
Yes, good evening, Rod. As a Roman Catholic, quite comfortable here in your cathedral. I was pleased to hear you acknowledge the contribution to the discussion of Pope Francis. Well, my question is, following on more or less of what's been said, I'm not sort of conscious of any sort of interfaith relationship in dealing with this matter. It's got a sort of what you might call a layperson's volume at the moment, not much spiritual aspect to it that I see. And I just wondered if you know of any relationships at a higher level, certainly between the Catholic Church and the Anglicans.
It's a really good question, I'm afraid I'm a bit rusty on that. There is really good things going on in the Catholic Church, for example, in New Zealand and in its various agencies. And although we talked a bit to each other, I'm not aware of us doing much together. However, a small group of us working under the wonderful umbrella of the Religious Diversity Centre, which was founded by Jocelyn and George Armstrong being Anglican clergy, who was very prominent in the anti-nuclear movement. We are working on an interfaith statement and some policy proposals to put to the government around climate, particularly to hopefully strengthen the resolve of the government to increase our United Nations commitment considerably in time for the Glasgow negotiations. And I can't promise this next bit yet. We're hoping to, and the Catholics, as a representative from the Catholic Church in our working group, we're still building out around the other faiths. But we also hope to launch a petition on a very accessible platform, probably Action Station, to get as many signatories as possible to also present that to the government. And time is very short. We want to get this to the government by the end of September. But this is a real interfaith response here in New Zealand to these issues.
From Rod's really big picture stuff about global petitions to the very local, I've been, one of the fascinating developments in Christchurch is that we've started working with Al Noor Mosque on zero waste. Just kind of spilled over from our Zero Waste for Churches program, and suddenly I've been hanging out at the mosque with my husband, with my scarf over my head, talking about their rubbish bins, which I would never have expected in a million years. But it is actually that, and the imam came into the room and was like getting really excited about the zero waste principles within Islam. Wow.
I think maybe in the interest of time, we should move towards supper. But if you have any more questions.
So, kia ora koutou. So there is Interfaith Council Nelson Tasman that's been established here in Nelson. We've been going on, two of the members are here at the moment and some out. So, I think it was 2016, and we are growing, and we have invited, we have members on our committee. We've got from the Buddhists, the Muslims have hosted us. I'm a Catholic of Catholic faith, and we've got the Latter-day Saints, the Methodists, and they've hosted us we have a program called Soul to Soul where there's an information gathering, and we could take this on. Yes, and we have invited the Catholic Church many times, and I've approached but we never really get any response directly from either the Richmond or the Nelson one. So, yeah, so we are still trying. We've got many projects. So just approach any of interfaith, and we are happy to take this on.
Good.
As the next project, we can work collaboratively. We can, small group can grow together.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to mention too that the Nelson Diocese is looking to become a denominational partner of Eco Church. And if you're part of a parish, I hope that your parish might be interested in becoming part of the Eco Church movement. If that's the case, please talk to me afterwards because we would really welcome that.
It's easy to find online, the website, EcoChurch NZ.
Yes, Eco Church NZ. And please join us for a cuppa if you can. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rod.